June 1944. The air along the Norman coast was heavy with the stench of burnt gasoline and shattered concrete. Amid the chaos, German officers began to grasp a truth far more devastating than the explosions around them. Their war was already lost. It wasn't the massive tanks or waves of infantry that brought this realization, but a far humbler machine, the American Jeep. When Oberleutnant Klaus Müller of the 709th Infantry Division watched the vehicles swarming near Sainte-Mère-Église on June 7th, he wasn't just seeing an invasion succeed, he was witnessing an industrial force so vast and efficient that it tore apart the very foundations of the German war machine. Müller stared in stunned disbelief at the endless column of American vehicles streaming inland from Utah Beach. In a mere 2-hour span, he counted 117 identical military reconnaissance cars, each one appearing as fresh as if it had just been driven off a factory floor. These small vehicles, which the Americans called Jeeps, had crossed the Atlantic Ocean by the thousands, their sheer impossible numbers revealing a truth more devastating than any artillery barrage. Germany was not merely fighting an army, but an entire industrial system that had effortlessly transformed warfare into a seamless process of mass production. The Jeeps began arriving with the first waves of landings, driven directly off the massive landing ship tanks, LSTS, that had crossed the English Channel in relentless, unending convoys. Each LST could carry up to 30 fully assembled Jeeps, and hundreds of these vessels were delivering their cargo daily to the Norman coast. The vehicles bore the markings of either the Willys Overland Motor Company of Toledo, Ohio, or the Ford Motor Company of Dearborn, Michigan. Officially designated truck 1/4 ton, 4x4 command reconnaissance, to the German soldiers witnessing them pour onto French soil, they signified something profoundly more ominous, undeniable evidence of an industrial capacity that defied all comprehension. Had the German military planners known the actual statistics of American Jeep production, they would have been utterly stunned. Between 1941 and 1945, American factories produced over 640,000 Jeeps. At peak production, Willys Overland and Ford were completing one vehicle every 90 seconds on their assembly lines. This single vehicle type represented 1/4 of all American military motor transport production. By contrast, the Germans, over the entire duration of the war, had managed to produce barely 50,000 Kübelwagens, their equivalent to the Jeep. They could not begin to conceive of such colossal numbers. What made this production miracle possible was a level of standardization that exceeded anything in German military experience. Every Jeep, whether manufactured by Willys or Ford, utilized completely interchangeable parts. A transmission salvaged from a destroyed Ford GPW could be installed in a Willys MB in mere minutes. Wheels, engines, axles, and even minor components like spark plugs and fan belts were identical across all production runs. This relentless standardization was not confined to the factory floor. It extended directly to the logistical supply system, where spare parts were prepositioned based on statistical analysis of failure rates, ensuring that replacement components were always available. The German military mind, rooted in the tradition of carefully preserving and maintaining every piece of equipment, struggled intensely to comprehend this American approach. In the Wehrmacht, a vehicle was assigned to a unit and meticulously tracked throughout its service life. Losing a vehicle through negligence was grounds for a court-martial. Mechanical problems were diagnosed with agonizing precision. Parts were carefully repaired or manufactured locally when replacements were unobtainable. Germany's equivalent to the Jeep, the Kübelwagen, required factory-trained mechanics for any significant maintenance. The Americans operated on entirely different ruthless principles. They had statistically calculated that a Jeep's combat life expectancy was only 90 days and planned accordingly. Rather than pouring resources into elaborate repair facilities, they simply manufactured replacements in quantities that overwhelmed any possible loss rate. When a Jeep was damaged beyond immediate repair, it was systematically stripped of usable parts and abandoned. A brand new vehicle would arrive within hours or days, delivered by the endless convoys that linked the invasion beaches to the advancing front lines. Lieutenant Colonel Otto von Schroeder, Chief of Staff of the 352nd Infantry Division, captured the German bewilderment in a poignant letter to his wife. The Americans fight a rich man's war. They expend vehicles the way we expend ammunition. He described observing a jeep strike a mine, whereupon the crew, emerging unharmed, simply transferred their equipment to another vehicle that appeared within minutes and continued their mission. The destroyed jeep was pushed unceremoniously to the roadside and forgotten. In our army, von Schroeder lamented, such a loss would require reports, investigations, and weeks of effort to obtain a replacement. By June 10th, American forces had landed over 12,000 vehicles in Normandy, with jeeps comprising the largest single category. These vehicles transformed the battlefield in ways German doctrine had never anticipated. American reconnaissance units penetrated German lines with unprecedented speed and flexibility. Artillery forward observers, operating from jeeps, could rapidly relocate after firing, making counter-battery fire nearly impossible. Supply units maintained continuous contact with advancing forces, eliminating the frustrating pauses for consolidation that German commanders had expected to exploit. The jeep's capabilities compounded German tactical difficulties. With its four-wheel drive and low weight, the vehicle could traverse terrain that German planners had deemed impassable for vehicles. The Norman bocage country, with its sunken roads and thick hedgerows, should have channeled American vehicles into pre-planned kill zones. Instead, jeeps simply drove through fields, over embankments, and around obstacles. They created their own road network, operating entirely independent of the mapped routes German forces had prepared to defend. Oberst Hans von Luck, commanding a battle group of the 21st Panzer Division, wrote after the war, "The jeep gave every American unit the mobility we had achieved only with our elite mechanized forces. A single jeep could swiftly carry a machine gun team, a mortar crew, vital communications equipment, or supplies. They seemed to materialize everywhere, in places the Germans thought secure, bringing firepower or calling in artillery strikes with their radios. We could not establish a continuous front because the Americans simply drove around our positions. The maintenance and supply systems supporting these vehicles proved equally overwhelming. American logistics units had prepared for operations on a truly industrial scale. Ships arrived daily, carrying not just ammunition and fuel, but entire spare engines, transmissions, and prepackaged component sets. Mobile workshops advanced immediately behind combat units, capable of performing any necessary repair or replacement. If a unit suffered the loss of 10 jeeps in combat, 10 replacements would arrive within 48 hours, often even sooner. Major Heinrich Zimmermann of the 12th SS Panzer Division observed that the American supply system operated like a factory production line extended to the battlefield. Everything was standardized, packaged, and delivered on a meticulous schedule. He noted that the Americans had successfully removed the friction from warfare that Clausewitz described. While the Germans struggled to maintain their aging, existing equipment, the Americans simply ordered replacements as if from a catalog. The psychological impact on German forces became evident within days of the invasion. Soldiers who had been indoctrinated with the belief that Americans were soft and overly dependent on material comfort discovered an enemy who possessed material abundance beyond imagination. The sight of the endless columns of identical jeeps, each one brand new and fully equipped, profoundly demoralized troops who were carefully preserving vehicles that had often been in continuous service since the Polish campaign. Gefreiter Wolfgang Braun, a mechanic with the 21st Panzer Division, examined captured jeeps and reported that every component was designed for mass production and easy replacement. The engine was simple but adequate, and the transmission was robust rather than refined. He concluded that while nothing was polished or precisely fitted, everything functioned reliably. They have sacrificed elegance for quantity, and quantity is winning the war. An unexpected complication for the Germans was the visible racial integration in the American motor pools. Indoctrinated in Nazi ideology, German observers were troubled to see African American soldiers driving, maintaining, and supervising these motor pools. This observation fundamentally challenged Nazi assumptions about racial hierarchy and military effectiveness. Feldwebel Kurt Wagner noted with palpable bewilderment that Negro soldiers operate and repair these vehicles with the same efficiency as white soldiers. He concluded, "Our racial theories suggest this should be impossible, yet the evidence is undeniable." American modifications to their jeeps further demonstrated a flexibility that German military culture could not easily accommodate. Within days of landing, units were welding on additional armor plate, installing specialized wire cutters to counter German piano wire traps, mounting multiple machine guns, and adapting the vehicles for specialized roles. Medical units converted jeeps into ambulances by installing stretcher racks. Signal units loaded them with extensive radio equipment, and engineers mounted mine detectors. These modifications, though crude by fastidious German standards, were immediately effective. The contrast with German equipment grew increasingly stark as the campaign progressed. The Wehrmacht's vehicles often required highly specific fuel grades, specialized spare parts, and mechanics with highly specific training. In shocking contrast, many German units still relied heavily on horse-drawn transport, with a single division requiring thousands of horses that consumed tons of fodder daily. These animals were vulnerable to artillery, demanded constant care, and limited mobility to a walking pace. Watching American units advance relentlessly at 30 miles per hour in vehicles that required only gasoline and basic maintenance was deeply, profoundly demoralizing. By June 15th, German intelligence estimated that American forces in Normandy possessed over 4,000 jeeps, with hundreds more arriving every day. This number seemed utterly impossible to officers who remembered the entire German army invading Poland with fewer than 3,000 motor vehicles of all types. The mathematics of American production suggested that the United States could lose every vehicle in Normandy and replace them all within just 2 weeks. Colonel Ernst Wagner of the Panzer Division compiled a grim report for Field Marshal Rommel shortly before his injury. "We face an enemy who has industrialized warfare to a degree we never imagined possible. They mass-produce military vehicles with the same methods they produce civilian automobiles. Every American soldier seems to know how to drive and perform basic maintenance. Their entire society is mobilized for mechanical warfare in a way ours never achieved." The disparity in production philosophy proved an unbridgeable chasm. German vehicles, like the Kubelwagen, were carefully constructed, well-engineered, and designed for longevity. But Germany could produce only a few dozen per day at peak output. American Jeeps were simple, crude by German standards, yet they rolled off assembly lines at rates Germany could not match, even with all its combined factories. Where German industry sought absolute perfection, American industry sought adequacy, multiplied by overwhelming numbers. General Major Fritz Bayerlein, commander of the Panzer-Lehr Division, provided a stark assessment. "We are fighting the last war while the Americans fight the next one. We perfect individual vehicles while they perfect the system that produces vehicles. We train specialist mechanics while they design vehicles any soldier can maintain. We are artisans fighting an assembly line, and the assembly line is winning." The redundancy built into the American system frustrated every element of German tactical planning. Destroying a bridge to halt American supply columns proved futile when engineers appeared with portable bridging equipment carried on jeeps. Ambushing reconnaissance patrols achieved little when identical replacement vehicles and crews appeared within hours. Mining roads only caused Americans to bypass the obstacles by driving through fields. Every perceived German tactical success was negated by the relentless tide of American material abundance. The Jeep became a potent symbol of this abundance, one that transcended its primary military function. German soldiers reported seeing Jeeps used for tasks that would have been completely unthinkable in the Wehrmacht: delivering mail, transporting journalists, carrying chaplains to forward positions, even moving generals' personal baggage. This casual use of military equipment for convenience rather than necessity demonstrated a level of wealth that German soldiers, long accustomed to scarcity and careful preservation, found both amazing and deeply demoralizing. Lieutenant Friedrich Hoffmann wrote to his family, "The Americans use their vehicles like we use bicycles, for everything, and without concern for where. I saw a Jeep being used to deliver hot food to a single outpost, a trip that wore the engine and consumed fuel for the comfort of 3 men. In our army, those men would walk and eat cold rations. This wastefulness should be a weakness, but when you can waste without consequence, it becomes a form of strength." The technological gap was further emphasized by the fact that American Jeeps came equipped with standardized toolkits, comprehensive maintenance manuals printed on waterproof paper, and spare parts packages calculated by statistical analysis. German vehicles often lacked basic tools, relied entirely on the mechanic's personal experience rather than documentation, and required a complex requisition system for scarce spare parts that could take weeks to navigate. As June bled into July, German forces found themselves increasingly unable to compete with American mobility. Static defensive positions were routinely outflanked by jeep-mounted reconnaissance units. Artillery positions were overrun by rapidly advancing motorized infantry. Supply lines were cut by fast-moving patrols that appeared behind German lines, struck decisively, and disappeared before reserves could respond. The entire battlefield had become fluid in ways that relentlessly favored the side with unlimited motorized transport. Major Wilhelm von Tauben, observing the American breakout preparations in late July, wrote, "They have achieved something we thought impossible, the complete motorization of an army. Every soldier can be moved by vehicle. Every gun can be towed at highway speeds. Every supply item can be delivered directly to the consumer. We are fighting a 19th century war against a 20th century enemy." The German High Command's attempts to counter American motorization proved utterly futile. Orders to target vehicle concentrations were meaningless when vehicles were simply everywhere. Efforts to interdict supply lines failed when every unit possessed organic transportation. Plans to exploit American dependence on fuel were negated by a supply system that delivered gasoline in quantities Germany hadn't seen since 1940. By the time of Operation Cobra in late July, American forces in Normandy possessed over 15,000 vehicles, with jeeps forming the single largest category. The German intelligence estimate, compiled from prisoner interrogations and aerial reconnaissance, suggested the Americans could suffer 50% vehicle losses and still remain more motorized than any German division at full strength. This calculation, when reported to Berlin, was dismissed as defeatist. It was, in fact, conservative. The influence of American motorization extended far beyond the immediate military impact. German officers who survived the war carried these searing lessons into the reconstruction of post-war Germany. The American model of standardization, mass production, and design simplicity would profoundly influence German industrial development. The Volkswagen, which had failed during the war as the Kübelwagen to compete with the Jeep, would succeed as the Beetle in peacetime, applying the mass production principles the Americans had demonstrated so devastatingly. Feldwebel Otto Schulz, who spent 3 years as a prisoner of war in America, later reflected, "In Normandy we learned that modern war was not about courage or skill, but about industrial capacity. The Americans showed us that victory belonged to whoever could produce the most, ship the fastest, and replace losses immediately. The Jeep was not just a vehicle, but a symbol of a new kind of warfare we were not prepared to fight." The story of German troops encountering American mass motorization in Normandy represents more than a military mismatch. It was a brutal collision between two fundamentally different civilizational approaches to warfare. The Germans, with their deeply ingrained tradition of professional military excellence and carefully maintained, refined equipment, met an American military that had transformed warfare into a relentless exercise in industrial management and mass production. In the end, the endless columns of jeeps that poured across Normandy represented something more profound than military vehicles. They were the physical manifestation of the arsenal of democracy, proof that American industrial might could be projected across oceans and delivered to battlefields in quantities that rendered traditional military calculations utterly obsolete. For the German soldiers watching those columns advance, each jeep was a messenger bearing the same simple, terrifying truth. The age of artisan warfare had ended, and the age of industrial warfare had begun. The last word belongs to Hauptmann Ernst Bergmann, who survived the Normandy campaign and became an automotive engineer in post-war Germany. He concluded that the Americans taught them a devastating lesson. The factory is more important than the battlefield. Their jeeps, arriving in endless numbers, each one identical and instantly replaceable, showed the Germans that warfare had become a branch of industry. We thought we were soldiers. They showed us we were simply workers in a factory of destruction, and their factory was infinitely larger and more efficient than ours. The war was not truly lost on the beaches or in the hedgerows. It was lost years earlier, on the assembly lines of Toledo and Dearborn. The defeat of the German army, then, was not a failure of courage or tactics on the part of the individual soldier, but a systemic failure of imagination and production. The American Jeep, simple, crude, and utterly replaceable, became the unvanquishable symbol of a nation's ability to mobilize its entire economy for war. It teaches a powerful lesson that resonates into our modern digital age. Ultimate strength does not lie in the perfection of a single, exquisite component, but in the overwhelming, standardized, and perfectly networked system that creates, supports, and replaces it without friction. We no longer fight with tanks and jeeps, but with chips and code, yet the core truth remains unchanged. In any massive global competition, is it our own ingenuity or the sheer scale and efficiency of our industrialized system that will ultimately decide the victory? Wehrmacht reminds us that the answer is terrifyingly clear.